The fastest way to lose respect in my house was to start acting like my things belonged to you. That was the sentence running through my head the morning I walked into my garage and found nothing but an oil stain where my Lexus had been parked less than 12 hours earlier. At first, I honestly thought the car had been stolen. My heart dropped so hard I had to grab the laundry room counter just to steady myself. I'm 67 years old. I live alone. And when you're a woman my age waking up to an empty garage before 7 in the morning, your mind doesn't go to misunderstanding. Your mind goes straight to panic. I looked around like somehow the car had magically rolled itself somewhere else overnight. But the garage was empty. Completely empty. No note. No explanation. Nothing. Then my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. One text message. Melissa. We borrowed the Lexus to take my parents to brunch. We'll be back later. Don't make this weird. I read that message 3 times. Slowly. Carefully. Because surely no grown woman would actually send something that disrespectful to her husband's mother. But there it was. Don't make this weird. Like I was the problem. Like I was supposed to smile because my daughter-in-law decided to take my $80,000 SUV without asking me first. I stood there in my robe staring at that text while my coffee machine beeped in the background. And the craziest part? This wasn't even the first boundary Melissa had crossed. It was just the first one big enough that I couldn't pretend anymore. Melissa had always been the kind of woman who treated other people's belongings like community property. The first Thanksgiving after she married my son Brian, she walked into my kitchen and rearranged my cabinets because she said my system didn't make sense. A month later she borrowed one of my cashmere sweaters and returned it stretched out with makeup stains around the collar. Then came the little comments. You don't really use this room, right? You should let family enjoy things. When people get older, they don't need as much space. Every sentence sounded polite enough on the surface, but there was always something underneath it. Something sharp. Something entitled. Brian never saw it. Or maybe he didn't want to see it. My son had spent most of his adult life trying to keep the peace. Even when keeping the peace meant letting his wife slowly disrespect everyone around her. Especially me. 2 years ago, after Brian lost his sales job, I helped them with the down payment on their house. I didn't tell anyone how much money I gave them because I wasn't trying to buy gratitude. I was trying to help my son stay afloat. But from the moment those papers were signed, Melissa started acting differently toward me. Like my generosity had somehow made me weaker instead of stronger. Like helping them meant I had no boundaries left. I remember one Sunday dinner when she opened my refrigerator without asking and packed leftovers into containers for her parents before I'd even sat down to eat. Her mother Denise laughed and said, Melissa's always been comfortable making herself at home. At home. In my house. Using groceries I paid for. I still kept my mouth shut. I told myself it wasn't worth the tension. That family survived by letting small things go. But small things have a way of growing when nobody stops them. And standing in that empty garage Sunday morning, I suddenly realized every single compromise I'd made had taught Melissa the exact same lesson. Helen won't do anything about it. I called Brian anyway. He answered on the 3rd ring sounding half asleep. Mom, why does your wife have my car? Silence. Then a sigh. Melissa told you already. Her parents are visiting. She took my car without permission. Another pause. You weren't using it today. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Brian, I said carefully, that car is in my name. Fully paid off. Insured under me. Parked in my garage. And your wife took it without asking. He sounded irritated now, like I was inconveniencing him. Mom, come on. It's just for the day. Melissa said you'd make this a whole thing. That sentence hit harder than I expected. Not because of Melissa. Because of my son. Somewhere along the line, my own child had started viewing my feelings as obstacles instead of something worthy of respect. I see, I said quietly. We'll talk later. Then I hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just stood there staring through the kitchen window at the empty driveway while something cold settled in my chest. You know what people misunderstand about older women? They think calm means powerless. They think because we don't scream we don't notice. But silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes silence is just observation. Around noon, my neighbor Sharon called me. "Helen," she said hesitantly, "I just saw Melissa driving your Lexus downtown." "Did you?" Her parents were with her. They all looked very dressed up. I thanked her and hung up. About 20 minutes later, Melissa posted photos on Facebook. There they were outside some upscale steakhouse 40 minutes away. Denise smiling in the passenger seat. Ronald grinning beside the car. Melissa holding designer shopping bags like she was filming some lifestyle commercial. And in the caption she wrote, "Family day with our favorite people." Not one mention that the vehicle belonged to someone else. I enlarged the picture slowly. My license plate was visible in every shot. Something about that made my stomach turn. It wasn't borrowing anymore. It was claiming. And suddenly all those little moments from the last 2 years started lining up perfectly in my head. Melissa asking where I kept spare keys. Melissa insisting on helping organize my paperwork cabinet. Melissa casually asking whether my insurance covered additional drivers. At the time, each question seemed harmless by itself. But together they painted a picture I didn't like at all. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out my vehicle folder. Insurance documents. Registration. Spare electronic key fob. Then I noticed something strange. The second garage remote was missing. I froze. Because I knew exactly where I kept it. And I knew I hadn't touched it in months. That was the moment this stopped feeling like disrespect and started feeling deliberate. I sat down at my dining room table very slowly, staring at the empty slot in the drawer while my phone buzzed again. Another text from Melissa. This time, with a smiling selfie inside my car. "We may keep it overnight, LOL." And that was the exact second I decided Monday morning was going to change everything. There is a moment in life when you realize someone is not testing your patience anymore. They are testing your limits. That Sunday afternoon, I sat alone in my kitchen staring at Melissa's smiling selfie from inside my car while a pot roast slowly cooled on the stove. I had spent 3 hours cooking dinner for people who clearly did not respect me enough to ask permission before taking something that belonged to me. The funny thing about disrespect is that it rarely arrives all at once. If it did, most people would shut it down immediately. No, disrespect arrives in layers. Quietly. Politely. One tiny excuse at a time until suddenly someone is treating your life like an extension of their own. I looked around my kitchen and started noticing things I had ignored for months. Melissa's favorite imported sparkling water filled half my refrigerator shelf because she had started keeping groceries at my house for convenience. A pair of her expensive sunglasses sat on my counter even though she had not visited in 3 days. There was a pink sweater hanging over one of my dining room chairs that did not belong to me either. Little signs. Tiny territorial flags planted throughout my home. I suddenly understood that Melissa had not borrowed my car impulsively. In her mind, she already believed it was partly hers. Around 4 in the afternoon, Brian finally called again. I let the phone ring twice before answering. "Mom," he said carefully, using the same nervous tone he used as a teenager whenever he knew he had done something wrong. "Melissa feels like you are upset." I almost laughed again. Upset. Such a soft word for what I was feeling. "Your wife took my vehicle without permission. We said we would bring it back. That is not the issue." He sighed loudly into the phone. "Mom, her parents are in town for the weekend. We were trying to do something nice for them. With my property." Another silence. Then he said something that changed the entire way I looked at my son. "You always make things about control." Leaned back slowly in my chair. "Control. You have rules about everything. Melissa feels judged around you." Judged. That word sat heavy in my chest because I finally understood what was happening. Melissa had spent years reframing basic boundaries as emotional attacks. If I did not want strangers wearing my clothes, I was controlling. If I wanted notice before people showed up at my house, I was difficult. If I expected permission before someone used my car, I was overreacting. Little by little, normal respect had been rewritten as selfishness. And Brian had accepted it. "Let me ask you something," I said calmly. "Would Melissa be comfortable if I walked into her house and took her car keys while she was sleeping?" He did not answer. "Would she laugh about it if I posted pictures online afterward?" "That is different." "Why?" Another long pause. "Mom, can we not do this today?" There it was. The real problem. My son did not want fairness. He wanted comfort. And comfort usually came at my expense. Enjoy dinner, I said quietly before hanging up. About an hour later, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked through the front curtains and saw Melissa climbing out of my Lexus wearing oversized sunglasses even though the sun was already setting. Denise and Ronald stepped out behind her carrying shopping bags from stores I knew were expensive. Melissa was laughing loudly before she even reached the front door. Then she walked into my house without knocking like she owned the place. "We brought cheesecake," she announced cheerfully. I stayed seated at the dining table. Melissa froze slightly when she saw my expression. Brian walked in behind her looking exhausted already. Denise gave me one of those uncomfortable smiles people use when they know something awkward happened, but hope pretending otherwise will fix it. "Helen," she said sweetly, "your car drives beautifully." Your car. At least one person in the room still understood ownership. Melissa tossed my keys onto the counter casually. "There was barely any gas left," she said. "You should fill it tomorrow." I stared at her so long the room went quiet. Because the audacity was almost impressive. She takes my vehicle without permission, drives nearly 100 miles around Southern California shopping with her parents all day, returns it almost empty, and then instructs me to refill it. Denise looked embarrassed. Ronald suddenly became very interested in the floor. But Melissa? She genuinely looked confused about why nobody was responding normally. That was the moment I realized entitlement had become natural to her. "Actually," I said calmly, "I will not be driving it tomorrow." Melissa shrugged. "Okay." Then she headed toward the kitchen like the conversation was over. I watched her open my refrigerator and start unpacking leftovers into containers for her parents to take home. My own kitchen. My own food. My own containers. I noticed Brian watching me carefully from across the room. He knew that look on my face. I had worn it exactly twice before in his life. Once when his father secretly emptied part of our savings account years ago. And once when a contractor tried overcharging me after my husband died. Quiet. Controlled. Finished. During dinner, Melissa dominated every conversation. She talked about a luxury resort she wanted Brian to book for Christmas. She talked about upgrading to a larger house in a better neighborhood. She talked about how stressful it was sharing only one garage at their current place. Then she laughed and said, "Honestly, Helen barely drives anymore anyway." The table went silent again. Brian looked down at his plate immediately. Denise shifted uncomfortably in her seat. And Melissa just kept eating like she had said something perfectly normal. I smiled slightly and took a sip of iced tea. "You are right," I said softly. Melissa brightened immediately, probably thinking I had finally accepted my place in whatever strange hierarchy she imagined existed. "See," she said to Brian, "I keep telling you your mom understands practicality." Practicality. Such an interesting word. People love using practical language when they are slowly justifying selfish behavior. Later that evening, after everyone finally left, I walked out to the garage alone. The Lexus sat there shining beneath the overhead light exactly where it always had. But it felt different now. Not because of the car itself. Because of what it represented. I opened the driver's side door and noticed Melissa had changed my seat settings. Her perfume lingered faintly inside the cabin. The navigation screen still displayed a route history from all the places they visited that day. Then I noticed something else. A small notification connected to the vehicle app system. Another authorized user had been added. My stomach tightened instantly. I clicked the profile. Melissa Turner. Access level. Full remote functions. I just stared at the screen for several seconds, because nobody could add themselves without direct access to the setup process. Which meant one thing. At some point before today, Melissa had already gone through my vehicle settings behind my back. This was planned. Carefully. Quietly. And standing there in that silent garage, I finally understood something that changed everything. Melissa was not treating me like family. She was treating me like an obstacle between herself and a lifestyle she thought she deserved. Some people think betrayal begins with a dramatic moment. It does not. Most betrayal begins when someone slowly stops seeing you as a person and starts seeing you as a resource. Monday morning, I woke up before sunrise even though I barely slept the night before. The house felt unusually quiet. Maybe because something inside me had finally gone still too. I made coffee, opened every curtain in the kitchen, and sat at the table with my old yellow legal pad. My husband used to joke that whenever I pulled out that notebook, somebody's life was about to get complicated. He was not wrong. I started writing down every financial connection I still had to Brian and Melissa. The down payment assistance. The emergency loan from 2 years earlier. The joint insurance discount Brian still benefited from under my policy. The storage unit I paid for when they moved houses. The vacation cabin membership I allowed them to use every summer. It was amazing what people started believing they deserved after enough time passed. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed again. Melissa. Can Brian borrow the Lexus? Later. His car needs an oil change. I stared at the message in complete disbelief. Less than 12 hours after taking my car without permission, she was already asking to use it again like nothing happened. Not apologizing. Not acknowledging boundaries. Just continuing forward with the assumption that access had already been granted permanently. I did not answer. Instead, I walked back into the garage and sat inside the Lexus with the doors closed. I needed to think clearly. The leather still carried traces of Melissa's perfume. The seat mirrors were adjusted differently. The radio presets had been changed too. Tiny details but deeply irritating ones. My late husband Frank bought this vehicle for me 3 years before he passed away. It was the first truly expensive thing we had ever purchased just for enjoyment instead of necessity. Frank called it my retirement reward. We spent 40 years working ordinary jobs, raising Brian, paying mortgages, covering medical bills, and stretching every dollar carefully. That car represented stability, independence, a life earned honestly, and now Melissa treated it like a rental from the airport. I opened the vehicle settings again and studied the access permissions carefully. Melissa still had remote access through the app system, which meant she could unlock the car, start it remotely, and track its location anytime she wanted. I felt something cold move through me again. Because normal people do not secretly add themselves to someone else's vehicle management system. That required planning, confidence, entitlement. I immediately removed her access profile. Then I changed every password connected to the account. After that, I disabled digital key sharing entirely. My fingers moved calmly across the screen while my heartbeat stayed perfectly steady. That was the moment I stopped reacting emotionally and started thinking strategically. Around 9:30, Brian called again. Mom. Good morning. He hesitated. Melissa said you did not answer her text. I saw it. So, can I borrow the Lexus this afternoon? I closed my eyes for a second because I genuinely wondered if I had entered some alternate reality. Overnight. No silence. Then confusion. Why not? Because it is my car. Mom, come on. No, Brian. You come on. My voice stayed calm but sharper now. Your wife took my vehicle without permission yesterday. Then I discovered she secretly added herself to the system access settings. And somehow both of you still believe you are entitled to ask for it again today. He sounded frustrated immediately. You are blowing this out of proportion. Am I? Melissa did not mean anything by it. That sentence right there explained almost everything wrong with their marriage dynamic. Intentions mattered more to Brian than actions. As long as Melissa claimed she did not mean anything, every behavior became excusable. Let me ask you something, I said quietly. Did Melissa ask before adding herself to my car system? No answer. Did she ask before taking the vehicle Sunday morning? Still nothing. Did either of you apologize afterward? He exhaled sharply. Mom, this is exactly why Melissa says you make everything uncomfortable. There it was again. Accountability translated into discomfort. Boundaries translated into hostility. Respect translated into inconvenience. Brian, I said softly, you know what your father used to say about borrowed things? He stayed quiet. He said the condition of borrowed property tells you exactly how much someone respects the owner. I ended the call before he could respond. About an hour later, Sharon from next door knocked on my front door carrying banana bread. But I could tell immediately she came for gossip too. Neighborhood women always know when tension is brewing. I saw Melissa outside your garage this morning, she said carefully while sitting at my kitchen counter. She looked upset. Did she? She tried opening the Lexus with her phone from outside. I smiled slightly into my coffee mug. That must have been disappointing for her. Sharon looked confused. You removed her access? Last night. Sharon leaned back slowly. Helen, are things getting bad? I thought about that question carefully. No, I said honestly. Things are finally getting clear. After she left, I spent the afternoon reviewing documents in my home office. And that was when I found something that made my stomach drop. Inside a folder Brian left behind months ago was a printout from a mortgage refinancing estimate. My house had been listed under potential family asset considerations. My house, the home Frank and I paid off after 32 years of monthly payments. The property sitting entirely in my name. I read the paperwork 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. Melissa and Brian had apparently discussed future refinancing possibilities, assuming eventual access to my property value. Not because I offered it, because they expected it. I sat there staring at those papers while every uncomfortable memory from the past 2 years suddenly rearranged itself into perfect order. Melissa asking whether I had updated my trust. Melissa encouraging me to downsize repeatedly. Melissa talking about how difficult large homes become for older people. She had never been casually curious. She had been assessing assets, evaluating leverage, measuring timelines, and suddenly the car incident looked very different. It was never about transportation. It was about testing ownership, testing what they could take without consequences. That evening, Melissa finally called me directly. Helen, she said brightly, using the overly cheerful voice people use when pretending conflict does not exist. Brian said you removed my app access. Correct. I think that was a little extreme. I think adding yourself without permission was extreme. Her tone hardened slightly. I was only trying to help with convenience. Convenience for who? Silence. Then she laughed softly in that patronizing way she always did whenever she thought someone older was being unreasonable. You know, most mothers would love having family close enough to share things. Share. Such a manipulative little word. Sharing requires permission. This was taking. Melissa, I said calmly, do not confuse access with ownership. Another silence. Longer this time. Then she said something that finally confirmed every suspicion I had been quietly building all weekend. Brian and I are going to be part of your future eventually anyway. Eventually. Not. If. Not hopefully. Certainly. Like my life had already become an inheritance waiting room in her mind. I looked around my quiet living room at the framed photographs, the books Frank collected for 40 years, the grandfather clock ticking softly near the staircase, and for the first time since my husband died, I felt genuinely protective instead of generous. Because generosity without boundaries does not create gratitude. It creates expectation. An expectation turns dangerous when people start believing your life already belongs to them before you are even gone. By Tuesday morning, I stopped asking myself whether Melissa respected me. The real question had become far more dangerous. How much of my life had she already decided belonged to her? That thought followed me through the entire morning while I cleaned the kitchen in complete silence. I moved slowly on purpose. Older women learn something important after enough years. When people underestimate you, speed becomes unnecessary. Calm people see more. And I was finally starting to see everything clearly. Around 10 o'clock, I drove to the bank. Not because anything urgent needed handling yet, but because I wanted to understand exactly where my vulnerabilities were. Frank handled most of our investments before he passed away, but after losing him I forced myself to learn every account, every policy, every legal document connected to our lives. At the time it felt overwhelming. Now it felt like survival. I sat across from my banker, a woman named Cynthia who had known me for almost 15 years. Everything okay, Helen? She asked after noticing how many folders I brought with me. I just want to review access authorizations, I said calmly. Especially emergency permissions. She nodded immediately and started pulling records. The deeper we reviewed everything, the more unsettled I became. Brian still appeared as secondary contact information on multiple accounts. My home emergency file listed both Brian and Melissa as approved family contacts. Even worse, an old digital authorization still allowed Brian temporary viewing access to one retirement account from years ago when I was hospitalized with pneumonia. Cynthia looked confused when I asked to remove everything immediately. Family disagreement? She asked gently. Boundary correction, I answered. That seemed to surprise her. But she processed every update without another question. By the time I left the bank, something inside me felt lighter. Not happier. Sharper. Like finally locking a door that should have been locked years ago. On the drive home, Brian called again. I let it go to voicemail. Then another call. Then another. Finally a text appeared. Mom, Melissa is upset. Why are you changing things? I stared at the message at a red light and almost smiled. Interesting. They noticed quickly. That told me one very important thing. They had been paying attention to my accounts far more closely than I realized. When I got home, there was another surprise waiting for me. Melissa's mother Denise stood on my front porch holding a white bakery box. The moment I saw her expression, I knew she had not come for dessert and conversation. I hope I am not interrupting, she said softly when I opened the door. Not at all. She followed me into the kitchen while glancing around awkwardly. Denise had always struck me as a woman who survived life by avoiding conflict at all costs. Pleasant. Polite. Nervous. The opposite of her daughter in almost every way. She placed the bakery box on the counter. I brought lemon squares. Thank you. Neither of us touched the box. After a few seconds she finally sighed. Melissa said things feel tense. I leaned against the kitchen counter quietly waiting for the rest. Denise lowered her voice. She feels like maybe you do not trust her. There it was again. Not apology. Not accountability. Emotional repositioning. Somehow I was supposed to defend myself for not trusting someone who secretly inserted herself into my property access systems. Should I? I asked calmly. Denise blinked. Excuse me. Should I trust her? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. That told me more than any answer could have. Denise knew her daughter crossed boundaries too. She just spent her life smoothing over the consequences afterward. Melissa can be confident, she said carefully. She gets excited about building a future. Building a future. Another soft phrase hiding something uglier underneath. With my assets? I asked. Denise looked embarrassed instantly. Helen, I do not think she means it that way. Then how does she mean it? Silence stretched across the kitchen. The grandfather clock ticked softly in the hallway. Finally Denise sat down slowly at the table. Can I be honest with you? Please. She folded her hands tightly together. Melissa grew up watching us struggle financially. Ronald lost his job twice while she was young. We rented until she was almost in college. I think security became very important to her. I nodded once because I understood that completely. Fear changes people. Poverty changes people. But struggle can either build gratitude or entitlement depending on character. Security is one thing, I said quietly. Ownership is another. Denise looked down at the table immediately because she knew I was right. Then she said something that made my chest tighten slightly. Melissa talks sometimes like everything will eventually blend together anyway. Houses, money, property, family resources. Family resources. The exact phrase Melissa used before. Hearing it repeated by her mother made something click into place permanently inside my mind. This was not spontaneous behavior. This was ideology. Melissa genuinely believed family boundaries should dissolve around her needs. Especially if older relatives had more than she did. Denise left shortly afterward looking emotionally drained. But before she reached the front door she paused. For what it is worth, she said softly, I do not think Brian sees what is happening clearly. After she left, I stood alone in the foyer thinking about that sentence. Because she was right. Brian did not see clearly. But not because he was innocent. Because convenience had blinded him. Melissa created comfort. Structure, momentum, and my son had slowly traded independent judgment for an easier life. That evening around 6, Brian and Melissa showed up unannounced. Again, I saw Melissa's white SUV pull into my driveway and immediately noticed she parked directly beside the Lexus like. She was comparing them, measuring them. I stayed seated in the living room while they let themselves inside using the emergency keypad code they still had. Another thing I mentally added to tomorrow's correction list. Melissa walked in first wearing expensive athleisure clothes and carrying a giant iced coffee. Completely relaxed. Like the last 3 days of tension had barely happened. "We need to talk," she announced immediately. Not "can we talk?" Not "is this a good time?" Just another declaration. Brian looked exhausted beside her. "Sit down," I said calmly. Melissa crossed her arms. "I think you are overreacting and creating division in the family." I almost admired her confidence. "You secretly added yourself to my car system. Because Brian said it would make things easier." I looked directly at my son. He immediately avoided eye contact. "Interesting. You also discussed my home value in your refinancing paperwork." Melissa's face changed instantly. Just for a second. But I saw it. Shock. Then recovery. That was hypothetical planning. Without my knowledge. Families discuss future planning all the time. Families also ask permission before involving other people's property. Her jaw tightened slightly. "I think you are taking this personally." Personally. I let that word sit in the air for a moment. "Melissa," I said softly, "you involved yourself in my finances, my property, my vehicle access, and my estate assumptions. Explain to me exactly how this is not personal." Brian finally jumped in. "Mom, nobody is trying to take advantage of you. Then why do I keep discovering things nobody mentioned?" Silence again. Melissa set her iced coffee down harder than necessary. "Honestly? Because every conversation with you feels like a test." "A test of what?" "Whether we are worthy enough for your approval." That sentence revealed more truth than she intended. Because Melissa did not want healthy boundaries. She wanted unrestricted access without scrutiny. Approval was not the issue. Accountability was. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway table where my car keys rested beside a framed photograph of Frank. Then I picked up the keys and looked directly at both of them. "You know what the difference is between trust and entitlement?" Neither answered. Trust is offered. Entitlement assumes. The room went completely silent after that. Then Melissa did something I will never forget. She looked directly at the Lexus keys in my hand and said very calmly, "At some point you are going to have to decide whether you want to act like family or act like a landlord." I stared at her for several seconds because underneath that sentence was the ugliest truth of all. She no longer saw me as a mother. Or even a person. In her mind, I had become an obstacle standing between her and a lifestyle she believed she deserved access to. Nothing reveals a person's true character faster than hearing the word no for the first time. By Wednesday morning, the atmosphere between me and Brian had changed completely. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like the air before a storm nobody wanted to admit was coming. I woke up early again and sat on the back patio with coffee, while the California morning slowly brightened around me. The roses Frank planted 20 years ago were blooming near the fence line. Birds moved through the trees. Everything looked peaceful. But inside my mind, pieces were still shifting into place. I kept replaying Melissa's words from the night before. "At some point you are going to have to decide whether you want to act like family or act like a landlord." The more I thought about it, the more revealing it became. Because landlords are people who expect agreements to be respected, payments honored, boundaries maintained. Melissa viewed those expectations as cruelty whenever they applied to her. Around 8:30, I called a locksmith and scheduled every exterior lock and keypad code at the house to be changed that afternoon. Not because I thought Brian or Melissa would physically do something outrageous. Because access changes people. And I was finally learning that unrestricted access had slowly erased all normal boundaries in their minds. After that, I called my attorney, Richard. I had known him for nearly 12 years. Kalman. Precise. The kind of lawyer who never raised his voice because he never needed to. "Helen," he said warmly when he answered, "what can I do for you?" "I need to review my estate structure immediately." There was a small pause. "Something happened?" "I think I have been too generous without enough protection." Richard did not ask unnecessary questions. "Come by at noon." The moment I hung up, my phone rang again. "Brian." "Of course." I answered this time. "Mom, Melissa is really hurt." I stared out across the yard silently for a second. Interesting choice of words. What does that mean? It means your wife secretly inserted herself into my financial and property systems, but somehow she is the victim. Brian sounded exhausted already. "You are twisting everything into something ugly." No, Brian. I am finally seeing it clearly. He sighed heavily. Can we just reset? Reset. Another comforting little word people use when they want consequences erased without accountability. No silence. What do you mean no? I mean we are past reset. His voice hardened slightly for the first time. So what? You are going to punish us now. There it was. The sentence I had been waiting for. Because healthy adults do not view boundaries as punishment. Only entitled people do. Brian, I said calmly, if respecting my property feels like punishment to you, then something is deeply wrong here. He did not answer immediately. Then he lowered his voice. Melissa feels like you never accepted her. I almost smiled sadly at that because it was partially true. Not because I disliked Melissa initially, but because from the very beginning, she carried herself like someone auditioning for ownership instead of belonging. There is a difference. Belonging comes with respect. Ownership comes with assumption. I accepted her for years, I said quietly. I welcomed her into holidays, birthdays, vacations, and family traditions. I helped pay your bills. I gave you both opportunities you could not afford alone. Do not confuse generosity with rejection. Then why does everything feel conditional now? Because you only notice conditions after unlimited access disappears. Another silence. Then Brian muttered something under his breath I could barely hear. Melissa said this would happen eventually. My grip tightened slightly around the coffee mug. What exactly did she mean by eventually? He hesitated too long. Nothing. Brian. She just said, older people get more protective as they age. Older people. Not me. Not his mother. Just older people. Reduced into a category. A stage to be managed. And what did she expect would happen after I became protective? He stayed quiet again. That silence answered enough. After the call ended, I sat outside for another 20 minutes thinking about how easily people reveal themselves when they stop seeing you as fully human. Aging does that sometimes. Especially to women. Society slowly starts treating older women like background furniture. Useful. Stable. Financially helpful. Emotionally available. But no longer central. Melissa did not see me as a woman who built a life. She saw me as accumulated assets attached to a future timeline. By noon, I arrived at Richard's office downtown carrying 3 folders and a growing sense of clarity. He greeted me personally and led me into a private conference room. Tell me everything, he said. So I did. The car. The digital access. The refinancing paperwork. The comments about my future assets. The hidden assumptions. Richard listened without interrupting once. When I finished, he folded his hands carefully. Helen, he said, you are describing progressive entitlement escalation. Meaning boundaries were crossed repeatedly without correction, so the behavior intensified naturally. Hearing a professional summarize it so plainly made me feel strangely validated, like I was not imagining things after all. Richard reviewed my documents for nearly an hour. Then he looked up at me seriously. You need stronger separation immediately. What kind of separation? Property access. Financial exposure. Estate assumptions. Emergency permissions. Everything. I nodded slowly because deep down I already knew that. There is something else, he added carefully. People who begin treating future inheritance like present ownership often become very reactive when boundaries return. That sentence stayed with me the entire drive home, because I had already started noticing the emotional shift. Melissa was no longer pretending sweetness consistently. Irritation was replacing charm. Control was slipping. And entitled people rarely handle loss of control gracefully. When I pulled into my driveway that afternoon, I noticed Brian's car parked outside already. He was sitting on my porch waiting. Alone this time. He looked tired. Older somehow. I walked up slowly holding my purse. What are you doing here? He stood immediately. I wanted to talk without Melissa around. That caught my attention. Inside the house, we sat at the kitchen table in silence for almost a full minute before he finally spoke. She thinks you hate her now. No, I said calmly. I think your wife became too comfortable treating my life like shared inventory. He rubbed both hands across his face. You do not understand how stressed things have been financially. Then explain why that became my responsibility without discussion. Nobody was trying to use you. Brian. My voice stayed soft. Your wife added herself to my car systems without permission. She thought eventually. He stopped abruptly. But too late. Eventually what? He looked trapped suddenly. Nothing. Say it. He stared down at the table. She thought eventually there would not be much difference between your things and ours anyway. There it was. Finally spoken aloud. Not implied. Not hidden beneath polite language. Direct ownership expectation. I leaned back slowly in my chair while something inside me settled permanently into place. Because the problem was no longer confusion. The problem was assumption. Brian, I said very quietly, your father worked double shifts for years to build this life. I worked weekends bookkeeping from our dining room table while raising you. We sacrificed vacations, new cars, and comforts for decades. None of this exists because somebody deserved access to it. It exists because we earned it. His eyes dropped lower. I know. No, I said softly. You knew. There is a difference. At that exact moment, the front door opened and Melissa walked inside without knocking again. She looked between us immediately. Suspicious. Calculating. What is going on? She asked sharply. Brian stood up too fast. Nothing. Melissa's eyes landed on the folders beside me from Richard's office. I saw the exact second her expression changed. Fear. Small but unmistakable. Then she smiled too quickly. Are those legal papers? I looked directly at her. Yes. The room went silent. And for the first time since all this started, Melissa no longer looked confident. She looked worried. The moment people realize they might lose access to something they never truly owned, their entire personality changes. Melissa proved that within 24 hours. After seeing the legal folders on my kitchen table, she became strangely polite for exactly one evening. The next morning, that politeness disappeared completely. I was watering the plants near the front porch around 9 when her SUV pulled into my driveway again. Fast. Aggressive. She stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying her phone in one hand like she was arriving for a confrontation she had already rehearsed in her head. This time she did not smile when she walked toward me. We need to clear something up, she said immediately. Not good morning. Not hello. Just demand. I turned off the hose calmly and set it aside. Do we? Brian told me you met with a lawyer. I did. Her jaw tightened slightly. Over a misunderstanding about a car? There it was again. The deliberate minimization. Reduce the behavior. Reframe the conflict. Make the reaction look irrational. This stopped being about the car days ago. No, she snapped quickly. You decided to make it about everything else. I studied her face carefully while she spoke. Melissa was beautiful in the polished, carefully curated way social media rewards. Perfect hair. White teeth. Expensive athleisure sets. She always looked like she belonged inside a luxury real estate commercial. But beneath that polish there was something else now. Panic. Small. Hidden. But growing. You know what I think? She continued before I answered. I think you are angry because you are not the center of Brian's life anymore. I almost smiled at how predictable that accusation was. Women like Melissa always turn accountability into jealousy eventually. This has nothing to do with attention. Then what does it have to do with? Respect. She crossed her arms immediately. I respect you. No, I said quietly. You manage me. That sentence hit harder than she expected because her expression changed instantly. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then she laughed softly in that cold little way she had whenever she wanted to appear unbothered. You are being dramatic. Am I? I walked past her slowly and opened the front door. Come inside. She hesitated before following me into the kitchen. I sat at the table while she remained standing. Interesting. Dominance positioning. Melissa always preferred standing during uncomfortable conversations because it made her feel in control. I noticed everything now. You said this was about family, I began calmly. So let us discuss family honestly. She rolled her eyes slightly but stayed quiet. Family does not secretly add themselves to someone else's property systems. That was convenience. Family does not discuss future access to someone else's home equity without permission. Her face hardened immediately. Brian should never have told you about that. Not denial. Not apology. Just anger about discovery. That told me everything. So it was real. She looked away briefly before speaking again. People plan for the future, Helen. Using other people's assets? You act like we are criminals. No, I said softly. I think you became comfortable. She laughed again, sharper this time. Comfortable? Brian is your son. We are supposed to be family. Family still requires boundaries. Not healthy families. That sentence almost impressed me with its manipulation. Healthy families. As if unlimited access equals emotional closeness. As if saying no somehow poisons relationships. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Melissa, did your parents ever allow unrestricted access to everything they owned? She opened her mouth then stopped. That is different. Why? Silence. I continued before she could recover. Would your mother be comfortable if I added myself to her banking information? Obviously not. Would your father appreciate me borrowing his vehicle without asking? You are twisting this. No, I said quietly. I am applying the same rules equally. Her face flushed slightly now. Frustration was replacing performance. You know what your real problem is? She said suddenly. You still want control over Brian. There it was again. Every boundary became emotional possession in her mind. She genuinely could not separate maternal respect from manipulation because she viewed relationships entirely through power and access. Brian is almost 40 years old, I replied calmly. If I wanted control, I would not have spent years helping him become independent. Helping him, she snapped. You mean financially controlling him? I stared at her carefully because that sentence revealed something important too. Melissa resented every form of assistance she could not fully own. To her, generosity created invisible power imbalances. And instead of feeling grateful, she felt threatened by dependence. Interesting, I said softly. You seem very angry about help you benefited from. We never asked for charity. That was such a fascinating lie I almost laughed out loud. The down payment assistance? I asked. The emergency loan? The storage unit? The insurance discounts? The vacation memberships? The medical deductible after Brian lost his job? Her silence filled the kitchen immediately. Melissa, I continued calmly, do not rewrite history simply because accountability makes you uncomfortable. At that exact moment, her phone buzzed loudly on the counter between us. She glanced down automatically. I noticed the screen before she flipped it over. A text message from someone named Ashley. The preview read, Did your mother-in-law calm down yet, or is she still being crazy about the Lexus? Melissa grabbed the phone too quickly. But not before I saw enough. Crazy. Of course. That was the narrative now. Not violated boundaries. Not entitlement. Just the irrational older woman refusing to cooperate with younger people trying to build a future. Melissa looked embarrassed for half a second before recovering again. You know what? She said sharply. I think this entire thing is sad. Sad. Yes. Because instead of enjoying your family, you are sitting here guarding possessions. Possessions. Another revealing word. People only criticize ownership when they want access to something that is not theirs. No, I said quietly. I am guarding respect. She picked up her purse immediately. Brian said you have changed since Frank died. That sentence landed differently than she intended. Not because it hurt, because it clarified something painful. My son had discussed me emotionally with his wife instead of protecting my dignity privately. Your husband discusses me like a management problem? I asked softly. Melissa instantly realized she revealed too much. That is not what I meant. But it was exactly what she meant. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway table where Frank's photograph still rested beside the keys. After my husband died, I said calmly, I spent years trying to keep this family close. I tolerated disrespect because I thought generosity created loyalty. That was my mistake. Melissa shifted uncomfortably now. The confidence from earlier was fading. Nobody is disrespecting you. I looked directly at her. You added yourself to my life before you earned your place in it. The room went completely silent. Then something surprising happened. Melissa's expression changed completely. The anger dropped for just a second and something colder appeared underneath. Calculation. You know, she said carefully, Brian and I have been talking. About what? Maybe it would be healthier if everyone had more separation for a while. There it was. The threat disguised as emotional wellness. Distance. Withdrawal. Access negotiation. I almost admired how strategic she really was beneath the surface. You should do whatever feels healthiest, I replied calmly. She picked up her purse fully now and headed toward the front door. But before leaving, she turned back one last time. Just remember something, Helen. One day you are going to need family more than family needs you. Then she walked out. I stood alone in the kitchen listening to her SUV disappear down the street while her words echoed quietly through the house. And for the first time since this entire situation began, I realized something truly dangerous. Melissa believed time itself was on her side. She thought aging would eventually force me into dependence. She thought loneliness would weaken my boundaries. She thought eventually I would surrender control willingly just to avoid being alone. What she did not understand was that women from my generation survived much harder things than loneliness. We survived disappointment, betrayal, sacrifice, reinvention. And unlike Melissa, I had already built my life once before from nothing, which meant I was perfectly capable of protecting it now. People become very honest once they realize kindness is no longer available to manipulate. By Thursday morning, Brian and Melissa had stopped pretending this situation was temporary. The polite texts disappeared. The cheerful excuses vanished. In their place came pressure. Subtle at first, then constant. I noticed it immediately after waking up to 3 missed calls from Brian before 8 o'clock in the morning. That alone told me something was wrong. My son hated conflict so much he usually avoided difficult conversations until absolutely necessary. But now he was calling repeatedly, urgently. I already knew Melissa was behind it. I made breakfast slowly before returning his call. Mom, he answered instantly, sounding stressed. Why did you remove us from the emergency contact file at the hospital network? I took a sip of coffee before answering. Because I updated my records. Without telling us? Why would I need permission? He exhaled sharply. That is not the point. Then what is the point? Silence. Then finally, Melissa feels like you are shutting us out on purpose. There it was again. Every boundary became emotional punishment in their minds. Brian, your wife literally told me I needed to decide whether I wanted to act like family or a landlord. She was upset. No, I said calmly. She was honest. That quieted him immediately. You are twisting her words. Am I? I walked toward the kitchen window and looked out at the driveway where the Lexus sat gleaming beneath the morning sun. Tell me something honestly. Did Melissa expect unrestricted access to my things eventually? He stayed quiet too long again. Brian. She just thought. He stopped. Thought what? That family should help each other. I almost smiled sadly because that sentence sounded so noble until you examined who was always expected to give and who was always expected to receive. Interesting, I replied softly. And when exactly were you planning to help me? Another silence. He had no answer because deep down, both of them viewed support as one-directional. Resources flowed downward toward them. Time flowed downward toward them. Sacrifice flowed downward toward them. Aging parents existed to stabilize younger lives until they became inconvenient. Mom, Brian finally said carefully, you are making Melissa feel unwelcome. In my own life? That is not fair. Neither is entitlement. He groaned quietly in frustration. Can we please stop using that word? That response alone confirmed everything. People only fear certain words when those words fit too well. Around noon I received another surprise. My grandson Ethan called me from school during lunch break. He was 11 years old and still young enough to speak honestly without understanding adult manipulation yet. Grandma, he said nervously, are you mad at Mom? I closed my eyes briefly because children always end up standing in emotional crossfire they never created. Why would you ask that? Mom said you are being difficult again. Again. I wondered how often Melissa used that word around the children when discussing me. Did she? She said you are trying to punish everybody. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. Ethan. Has anybody explained what actually happened? Not really. Of course not. Children only receive edited versions that protect adult narratives. Your mother took something important without asking permission, I said gently. And Grandma did not think that was respectful. Ethan thought about that for a second. Like if somebody borrowed my bike without asking? I smiled despite myself. Exactly like that. Oh. A pause. Then quietly, Mom would be really mad if somebody did that. There it was. Pure logic. Simple. Honest. Children often understand fairness better than adults because they have not learned how to manipulate language yet. After hanging up, I sat there thinking about how quickly Melissa reframed this entire situation for everyone around her. Suddenly I was not a woman protecting boundaries. I was difficult, punishing, controlling, reputation management. That was Melissa's real talent. Not cruelty, presentation. She understood instinctively that whoever controlled the emotional narrative controlled the social outcome. But she made one major mistake. She assumed silence meant weakness. She forgot older women grew up surviving quietly long before social media taught people to announce every feeling publicly. That afternoon, Sharon knocked on my front door again carrying grocery bags. I saw Melissa at the pharmacy earlier, she said casually while unpacking strawberries onto my counter. She was talking about you pretty loudly. I stayed calm. What did she say? Sharon hesitated. She said you were becoming paranoid and isolating yourself. I almost laughed out loud. Paranoid. Such an efficient word. It instantly transforms observation into instability. Interesting, I said softly. Sharon leaned against the counter carefully. Helen, I hope you do not mind me saying this, but something about all this feels strange. How so? Melissa talks about your future constantly. Not emotionally. Financially. That did not surprise me anymore. What exactly did she say? Sharon looked uncomfortable. At Bunko night last month she joked that you were sitting on a gold mine with that house in retirement. I felt something inside me go completely still. Did anybody respond? A few women laughed awkwardly. But honestly, it bothered people. Good. At least someone still recognized impropriety when they heard it. Thank you for telling me. After Sharon left, I walked upstairs to my bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed where Frank kept old family documents. Inside were decades of photographs, mortgage records, military papers, tax returns, and handwritten letters from years before email replaced everything personal. I sat there sorting through our entire life together while afternoon sunlight stretched across the carpet. There we were at 24 years old standing beside our first apartment. There was Brian as a baby wrapped in hospital blankets. There was Frank teaching Brian how to drive in an old pickup truck 30 years ago. Looking through those pictures, one realization hit me harder than anything else had all week. Melissa never respected what it took to build this life because she never witnessed the sacrifices behind it. To her, the finished product looked effortless. Comfortable house, stable retirement, paid-off vehicle. But she never saw Frank working overtime for 11 straight months after the factory layoffs. She never saw me balancing grocery money against utility bills. She never saw us cancel vacations so Brian could attend better schools. Wealth built slowly through discipline always looks easy to people who arrive later. Around 6 that evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. We need to discuss future expectations as a family. Future expectations. I stared at those words for a long time because they sounded less like a conversation and more like negotiation terms. I did not respond. 10 minutes later another message appeared. Avoiding communication is unhealthy. Again with the psychological language. Melissa loved dressing control and therapy vocabulary because it made resistance sound emotionally immature. Then a third message arrived. Brian is really hurting over this. That one almost worked. Almost. Because for a split second, guilt moved through me the way mothers are trained to feel guilt whenever their children suffer emotionally. But then I remembered something important. Brian was not hurting because I mistreated him. He was hurting because boundaries disrupted comfort. Those are very different things. Later that night, while getting ready for bed, I noticed headlights slowly moving past my house outside the bedroom window. Melissa's SUV. She drove slowly enough to confirm my car was still there before continuing down the street. I stood motionless behind the curtains watching her disappear into the darkness, while a cold certainty settled over me completely. This was no longer just family tension. This had become a power struggle over access, control, and future expectation. And for the first time since this began, I realized something deeply unsettling. Melissa was not trying to repair the relationship anymore. She was trying to regain leverage. The most dangerous moment in any relationship is when one person realizes the other is no longer emotionally controllable. By Friday morning, Melissa understood she could no longer pressure me through guilt, family language, or emotional manipulation. So she changed tactics completely. I noticed it the second Brian arrived alone at my house carrying grocery bags and acting unusually gentle. "I brought lunch," he said carefully while stepping into the kitchen. I looked at the bags. Expensive deli sandwiches from a place Melissa knew I liked. That alone told me she helped plan this conversation. Brian never remembered restaurant names. "That was thoughtful," I replied calmly. He looked relieved by my softer tone immediately. Poor boy. My son still believed kindness automatically meant surrender. We sat at the kitchen table while he unpacked lunch awkwardly. For the first 10 minutes he avoided the real subject entirely. Work stress, traffic, Ethan's baseball practice. Anything except the obvious tension hanging between us. Finally, he sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair. "Mom, I hate this." "So do I." "Then why does it feel like you are escalating everything?" There it was again. The assumption that protecting boundaries creates conflict while violating them somehow does not. "Brian," I said quietly, "do you know what escalation actually looks like?" He frowned slightly. "What?" Escalation is secretly adding yourself to someone else's property access. Escalation is discussing future control over assets that do not belong to you. Escalation is teaching children that boundaries are cruelty. His expression tightened immediately. "Melissa never did that. Ethan called me yesterday." That shut him up instantly. He looked genuinely uncomfortable now. Good. Maybe discomfort was finally reaching him. "He is a child," Brian muttered. "Exactly. Which means." He repeated what he heard. Silence settled between us while traffic moved faintly outside the kitchen window. Then Brian lowered his voice carefully. "Melissa thinks you are preparing to cut us out completely." Interesting. Not hurt emotionally. Concerned strategically. Why would she think that? Because of the lawyer meetings. The account changes. The lock changes. I watched him very carefully while he spoke because suddenly something clicked into place. They knew far too much about my personal updates. How exactly does Melissa know about my account changes? Brian hesitated. Too long. "Brian." He looked trapped again. A fraud alert notification accidentally got sent to one of the old shared contact emails. My stomach turned cold instantly. Shared contact email. Another thing I had forgotten to remove. Another hidden threat of access I did not even realize still existed. How long has Melissa had visibility into my notifications? Not visibility exactly, he said quickly. Just some connected alerts. I leaned back slowly in my chair because suddenly every strange coincidence from the past year started rearranging itself again. Melissa always seemed to know when I made financial decisions unusually quickly. When I sold stock last winter, she called within days asking whether I had extra flexibility lately. When I refinanced a certificate account, she suddenly started talking about vacation property investments. At the time, I dismissed it as coincidence. Now I knew better. "Brian," I asked quietly, "has your wife been monitoring my financial activity?" "No," he answered too fast. Then slower. "Not officially. Not officially." What an extraordinary phrase. "Explain that." He rubbed his forehead heavily. Sometimes she noticed alerts or account emails and got curious. Curious. That word again. Curiosity becomes very dangerous when paired with entitlement. "And you allowed this?" I did not think it mattered. There it was. The core problem. My son no longer recognized privacy because constant access had normalized intrusion inside his marriage. "It mattered to me," I said softly. He finally looked ashamed. Truly ashamed for the first time all week. "Mom, I think things just got blurry." "Blurry?" "Yes. Boundaries always become blurry when nobody reinforces them early enough. Do you know what your father protected more carefully than money? I asked quietly. Brian shook his head slightly. Dignity. Especially mine. I looked around the kitchen slowly. Frank never allowed anyone to make me feel managed inside my own life. That sentence hit him harder than I expected because his eyes dropped immediately. We sat there in silence for almost a full minute before he spoke again. Melissa feels insecure around you. I almost laughed at the absurdity of that. Melissa did not feel insecure around me. She felt blocked by me. Those are entirely different emotions. Why? I asked calmly. Because you judge everything.
No, irraplia sufli.
I notice everything. Another silence. Then something surprising happened. Brian looked genuinely exhausted. Not defensive. Not angry. Just tired. You do not understand what it is like living with constant financial pressure, he admitted quietly. Everything costs more now. The house payment. Ethan's school expenses. Insurance. Groceries. We are always behind. I listened carefully because finally, beneath all the manipulation and entitlement, something honest had appeared. Fear. And Melissa thinks my life represents security, I said softly. He nodded slowly. Sometimes I think she sees your stability and panics about our future. There it was. The real truth underneath everything else. Melissa was terrified. Not evil. Terrified. But fear without boundaries becomes greed remarkably fast. Fear does not justify access, I said quietly. I know. Then why did you allow this to happen? Brian stared at the table for a long time before answering. Because it happened slowly. That answer was painfully accurate. Boundaries rarely collapse dramatically. They erode gradually through small compromises nobody corrects early enough. Then Brian said something that changed the entire direction of the conversation. Melissa found out about your trust. My chest tightened immediately. How? She saw paperwork when you asked me to help move boxes after the flood last year. Of course. Another moment I dismissed as harmless. What exactly did she see? He looked miserable now. Estimated asset summaries. I closed my eyes briefly because suddenly everything made perfect sense. The increased confidence. The future planning language. The entitlement escalation. Melissa was not imagining abstract wealth anymore. She had seen actual numbers. Did she discuss it often? I asked quietly. Brian hesitated again. Sometimes. How often? More than I should have allowed. There it was. Honesty finally arriving through exhaustion. She started talking about how different our lives could be someday, he admitted softly. She said family wealth should stay within family. Family wealth. Such a convenient phrase when discussing someone else's lifetime of work. And what did you say? Brian looked ashamed again. Nothing. Exactly. That was always the problem. My son confused silence with peacekeeping. But silence protects the aggressor every time. Around that moment, Brian's phone buzzed loudly on the table. Melissa calling. He stared at the screen without answering immediately. Then another call. Then another. She knows you are here? I asked. Yes. Does she know what we are discussing? He hesitated. That answer was enough. Of course she did. This lunch was not reconciliation. It was information gathering. Pressure management. Damage control. Brian finally silenced the phone and looked at me helplessly. I do not know how things got this bad. I studied my son carefully and for the first time all week, I felt genuine sadness instead of anger. Because underneath all this manipulation and entitlement was still the little boy Frank and I raised. A boy who once cried for 3 days after accidentally scratching a neighbor's truck with his bicycle, because honesty mattered to him that much. Somewhere along the way, comfort replaced integrity. It got bad, I said quietly. The moment your wife started viewing my future as part of her financial plan. At that exact moment, another notification appeared on Brian's phone screen, lighting up the table between us. I saw it clearly before he turned the phone over. A message from Melissa. Did she mention changing the will yet? The room went completely silent. Brian slowly closed his eyes. And for the first time since this all started, neither of us could pretend anymore. There are moments in life when denial finally collapses under the weight of undeniable truth. Seeing that message on Brian's phone changed something permanent between us. Not because Melissa wanted to know whether I was changing my will, because she assumed the conversation was already happening. Like my future decisions existed primarily as updates affecting her financial expectations. Brian slowly turned the phone face down on the table, but it was too late. We both saw it. We both understood it. And for the first time since this situation began, my son looked genuinely afraid. "Mom," he started quietly. I held up my hand. "Do not." The silence between us felt heavier than any argument we had shared all week. Outside, a lawnmower hummed faintly somewhere down the street while afternoon sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor. Everything looked normal. But inside that room, something fundamental had broken open. "She did not mean it like that," Brian finally whispered. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Then how did she mean it?" He had no answer because there was no alternate interpretation left anymore. The mask had slipped too far. I stood up slowly and walked to the sink, mostly because I needed a second to steady myself. Not emotionally. Mentally. There is a difference. Emotion clouds judgment. Clarity sharpens it. And I had never felt clearer in my life. "How long?" I asked quietly without turning around. "How long has Melissa been discussing my will?" Brian stayed silent behind me. "Brian." I heard him exhale heavily. "Since after the flood." The flood? Of course. The same period when she accidentally saw the trust paperwork while helping move boxes from the garage. Did she ask directly? Not at first. I turned around slowly. Eventually. He looked exhausted now. Defeated. At first it was hypothetical conversations. Then planning conversations. Then, he stopped. Then what? Then she started talking like certain things were already expected. There it was again. Expected. Such a revealing word. Expectations are dangerous when attached to resources that do not belong to you. "Did you correct her?" I asked softly. His silence answered before he spoke. "Not enough. No, not enough." Because every unchallenged assumption had slowly transformed into entitlement. Every silence had functioned like permission. I sat back down at the kitchen table and folded my hands carefully. "Tell me exactly what she expected." Brian rubbed both hands over his face before answering. "She thought the house would eventually go to us. Without discussion. She assumed because I am your son. And the rest." He looked embarrassed now. "The investments. The retirement accounts. The cabin membership." I nodded slowly because none of it surprised me anymore. Did she ever discuss timelines? That question visibly shocked him, which told me the answer immediately. "Brian." He looked down at the table. "Sometimes she talked about how difficult aging alone could become." My chest tightened slightly. "Meaning?" "She thought eventually you might move closer to us. Or into assisted living. Something like that." I stared at my son in complete silence because suddenly I understood the full picture. The conversations about downsizing. The comments about older people needing less space. The increasing involvement in my finances. None of it was random. Melissa had been mentally reorganizing my future around her convenience for years. "Did she ever ask what I wanted?" I asked quietly. Brian closed his eyes briefly. "I do not think she looked at it that way. No. She did not. Because in Melissa's mind, my future had already become a logistical transition instead of an independent life. That realization hurt more than I expected. Not because of the money, because of the erasure. Somewhere along the line, I stopped being a woman with autonomy in her eyes and became a future asset redistribution event. We sat there quietly until Brian finally spoke again. "Mom, I think things got out of control." I almost smiled sadly at how passive that sounded. As if entitlement naturally appeared like bad weather instead of being tolerated repeatedly. "Things got comfortable," I corrected softly. "There is a difference." Right then the front door opened without knocking again. Melissa. She walked into the kitchen carrying her phone and immediately froze when she saw our faces. "What happened?" she asked sharply. Neither of us answered immediately. Her eyes moved to Brian's phone sitting upside down on the table. Then back to me. Intelligent women always know when a room changes temperature. Brian, she pressed. He looked trapped, cornered. For the first time since all this began, I watched my son realize he could not manage both realities anymore. She saw your message, he admitted quietly. Melissa went completely still. Not embarrassed. Calculating. I could almost see her deciding which version of herself to become next. Defensive? Emotional? Apologetic? Angry? Finally she sighed dramatically and set her purse down. Honestly? Good. That response surprised even Brian. Melissa, he warned softly. But she kept going. At least now we can stop pretending this is only about a car. There it was. Full honesty at last. You are right, I said calmly. It never was. Melissa crossed her arms immediately. Then let us be adults and discuss reality. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Go ahead. You are 67 years old, Helen. Interesting. Not mom. Not family. Just Helen now. And eventually decisions are going to have to be made. About my life? About practicality. That word again. Always practicality. Never dignity. Never independence. Never choice. You live alone in a 5-bedroom house. That I own. You barely drive. I drive enough. You have assets sitting unused while your family struggles. There it was. Finally spoken plainly. Not hidden behind emotional language anymore. Access. Redistribution. Justification. I studied her carefully while she spoke because I realized something important. Melissa genuinely believed she was being rational. In her mind, older people holding on to independence while younger relatives struggled financially looked selfish. Let me ask you something, I said quietly. Do you believe my life belongs to me? That question caught her off guard. What? Simple question. Do you believe my life belongs to me? She hesitated too long. Of course. Then why do you speak about my future like a management project? Silence. Brian looked sick sitting beside her now. Melissa finally exhaled sharply. Because somebody has to think ahead. For me. For the family. I nodded slowly because there it was again. The collective language that erased individual ownership. Melissa, I said softly, you keep using the word family when what you really mean is access. Her expression hardened instantly. That is unfair.
No, irraplia calmly.
What is unfair is treating a living woman like deferred inventory. Brian flinched physically at that sentence because he knew it was true. Melissa looked furious now. You are twisting everything into something ugly. No, I said quietly. I am removing the polite packaging. The room went completely silent after that. Then Melissa laughed softly, but there was no warmth left in it anymore. You know what your real problem is? She said coldly. You think money gives you power over people. I stared at her carefully because that accusation revealed more about her worldview than mine.
No, irraplia.
Boundaries give me power over myself. For the first time all week, Melissa looked directly rattled by something I said. Because people who rely on emotional leverage struggle when someone stops reacting emotionally. She picked up her purse abruptly. Fine, she snapped. Do whatever you want with your precious assets. Then she turned toward Brian. Are you coming? My son looked between both of us helplessly. And suddenly I realized the real tragedy of this entire situation. Brian thought choosing peace meant avoiding decisions. But eventually life forces choices anyway. Brian, I said softly before he stood up. Your father spent 40 years teaching you something you seem to have forgotten. He looked at me silently. Love without respect becomes exploitation. The room went still again. Melissa rolled her eyes and walked toward the front door. But Brian did not move immediately. He just sat there staring at the table while the truth finally settled over both of us completely. This was never about misunderstanding. It was about expectation. And expectations become very dangerous once people start believing they are entitled to your future before you are even gone.